Well, good evening. My name is Paul Walter. I'm the Executive Director of the Sauk County Historical Society. Pleasure to be here. I have a lot of fun putting these together because I learn a lot about the communities that we talk about, and Rock Springs is really one of the most kind of romantic, places and histories, and really when we get into Colonel Abelman, one of the figures that looms larger than life even today, and really stands out among, nobody really knows who David C. Reed is, the founder of Reedsburg, or Chauncey Logan, who Loganville is named after, but Colonel Abelman still lives large in history even today, so we'll talk about him in a little bit. But we want to get started tonight with kind of some general background of the area. People, of course, have been living in this area for a long time. This, of course, is Natural Bridge State Park and the Radatz Rock Shelter, which is underneath the natural bridge. And this is where evidence of human habitation has been found. This is the oldest site known in the upper Midwest, at least 10,000 years ago. After the last ice age, people were camping out under there. Fast forward several thousand years and we get into the Native American effigy mounds in the area, another sign of human habitation from anywhere from 750 to 1250 years ago. Ken Lange is here, who was the naturalist at Devil's Lake State Park and put this great map together in 1974, charting all of the locations of effigy mounds in Sauk County. The ones that we knew about, there was at one time 1,500 to perhaps 2,000 mounds in the county, and Ken charted the ones that antiquarians and historians and other people recorded and told us about. And we'll zoom in a little bit, but the circles are conical mounds, the round ones. The plus sign is an effigy mound, or an animal effigy mound, and an X is a linear mound, long mound. And so if you have a wagon wheel, that's an evidence of all three at that site. So we can see how the mounds were clustered oftentimes around the same areas where we are today. Of course, Baraboo was once called the Mound City. And again, these are just the ones that we knew about. There were hundreds more that were plowed up or destroyed. If we zoom in on the Rock Springs area, Rock Springs is right here. So none that we know of right in here, but the fact that there's two on either side, actually two over here and one up here, and they were along the Baraboo River, highly suggestive that there were probably some effigy mounds in this area. And of course, the rocks are very similar to the Devil's Lake area where there are other effigy mounds. So people have been here for a long time. Of course, this area is part of the Driftless Region. This line, not the blue line, but there's a dotted line in there that kind of shows the edge of the Driftless Region. This was the unglaciated area of southwestern Wisconsin. The rest of this was covered by glaciers more than once, and that left this highly more hilly and interesting, quite frankly. So Rock Springs, of course, is in that area. This is a aerial satellite view of Sauk County, and of course we can see with the trees and Devil's Lake there the evidence of what we call the quartzite canoe, the Baraboo hills that are in a kind of canoe-shaped pattern with the quartzite coming up through the other layers. Rock Springs being up here in the upper side of the canoe. Also of note, one of the largest stretches of hardwood forest in the upper Midwest. Now, fast forward to 1634, when John Nicolay was the first European to visit what is now known as Wisconsin, up at Green Bay. And he eventually came down the Fox and Wisconsin River waterways, possibly down as far as the bottom of Sauk County. He was, of course, looking for the fabled Northwest Passage to get across the continent faster. He came to a wide spot in the Wisconsin River and thought, aha, this must be it. Turned around and went back and didn't go any further. So he didn't know what he had actually found. But of course, that opened up the area, and it was fur trade country then for the French, the British, and the Americans for many, many years after that 1634 visit. By the 1820s, the Ho-Chunk that were here were starting, and other Native Americans were starting to feel some friction from lead miners that were invading the bottom portion of the state here. The fur traders, of course, didn't want to stay and settle. They just wanted to trade furs and go back. But of course, lead miners wanted to dig up lead and iron ore. And that started the tension between the settlers and the Native Americans. That led, of course, to the Winnebago War, and eventually the U.S. Army set up forts along this Wisconsin River waterway, including at Portage, Fort Winnebago. And for a few years in the 1830s, the Wisconsin River and the Fox River became the dividing line between settlement to the south and east and native areas to the north and west. Of course, it was in 1837 that the Ho-Chunk were kind of coerced, tricked into signing yet another treaty to divest of their lands on the north and west sides of the Wisconsin River, and they were then forcibly removed several times from the area. But that opened up settlement into what is now Sauk County. Settlement started, of course, down in the Prairie du Sac and Sauk City areas. The first county seat was Prairie du Sac, actually. And, of course, the large Sauk Prairie was a very desirable place to claim land, being treeless, although it was a lot of hard work to plow up the prairie, which was 6 to 7 feet tall. And then, of course, settlement went up waterways, like Honey Creek was an early settlement avenue. Finally, people got over the Baraboo Bluffs and saw the Baraboo River and the rapids there. That was a desirable spot. And eventually we'll talk about people continuing to travel up the Baraboo River and settle this area here. As I mentioned, the two first settlements started were Prairie du Sac and Sauk City. In 1845, there was an expedition mounted by a group of 6 gentlemen to see if the interior of the county was fit for habitation. Nobody knew what was beyond all these bluffs and rocky points to the west and north of the Sauk Prairie. So I'd like to read you what William Canfield wrote about it, because he was on the expedition. In the summer of 1845, at one of those meetings to decide the location of the county seat, a committee was appointed consisting of Augustine Haratzi, Edmund Rentorf of Sauk City, Levi Moore, Abraham Wood, Thomas Remington, and William H. Canfield of Baraboo, to make an exploration of the interior of the county to ascertain whether the land was fit for settlement and cultivation. It was urged by the people of Sauk County that the interior of the county was one complete mass of rocky bluffs, wholly and entirely unfit for cultivation. The committee started out on their exploration on the 10th day of November, 1845. Count Haratzi's mare and a week's provisions, a shotgun, 2 rifles, and a bird dog consisted the outfit. We took the Pinery Road to Sealy Creek, so that would be up in this direction, and camped that night in a pinery shanty. So this area had already been logged. In the morning, the Count took the halter off the mare and told her to go home to her colt. And taking one day's provisions, we started into the primeval forests. The next day, Wood shot a deer, but did not get it, and a partridge which the Count bag had to suffice for dinner. This is for 6 people. For dinner, supper, and breakfast for 6 stalwart men. Another day of dinner, supper, and breakfast was passed with nothing but water to drink, and the next breakfast and dinner also were a blank. We intended to shoot the dog that night for supper, but Providence smiled upon us, and Captain Moore's trusty rifle brought down a fine yearling buck, whose fat sides and hams were soon to be seen in pieces roasted around the fire on sticks. We crossed over the headwaters of Honey Creek, passing on to Bear Creek, thence down Narrows Creek to the Baraboo River. So a kind of circuitous route, as far as I can tell, would have been up here in the Sealy Creek area, down across the headwaters of Honey Creek, which could be as far up as here, then down Narrows Creek to the Baraboo River and back. The committee reported to a subsequent mass meeting that the interior of the county was not only fit for cultivation, but would make a fine agricultural district. This is jumping ahead a little bit, an early plat map of Sauk County. The very large dark lines constitute the original 6 towns of varying size, and you can see their names in bold letters. So the town of Baraboo was actually all of this up here, including part of northern Excelsior, and where the town of Baraboo is today was actually the town of Brooklyn. So it took a while for things to settle down to the configuration we have today. And this strip of towns over here was eventually peeled off and given to Richland County, except for Woodland Township, which is why we have that strange little ear up there on Sauk County. Now, the first things to do for settlement, people could come over here and squat on some land. Some of them would take a plow and plow a mile square, around 640 acres, and they were going to claim that as soon as they could buy it. But before they could buy it, the federal government had to send in surveyors, federal surveyors, to determine what was here. So back at the land office in Mineral Point, a person could come in and say, well, I'm located on the Baraboo River where this other creek comes in, and I want to claim this quarter section right here. So this is the early survey map for the town of Excelsior, where we are tonight. And again, settlement had already started, so we already see some fields down here, and we'll talk about those in a minute, some roads and trails, and of course Rock Springs is right here where Narrows Creek comes into the river. Now this was the surveyor's little sketch map, and he actually notes the high bluffs along and the rocks along the river there. Other things to note are swampy areas like this, and if they knew of things like iron ore deposits, they would note those as well. Now if we look at the more formal, those were turned into more formal drawings called the official plat maps. This is east of here in the town of Baraboo now, but I wanted to point out settlement came over the bluffs, and of course the rapids at Baraboo, the river drops 45 feet from one side of town to the other, so that was a great place to start building some dams. And here at the upper Oxbow, West Baraboo is right here, and Oxner's Park is right there. This is the upper Oxbow where the first dam on the Baraboo River was built in 1839. It was later another dam was built on the other side of the Oxbow, and they thought, well, it'd be really great to dig a channel across that point of land and get more fall for the water. But anyways, settlement started here in 1839, and we'll talk about those that came further up the river. First of those in the town of Excelsior here was a Captain Joseph Finley. We know very little about these people except that they were recorded in early histories. He was a bachelor from Tennessee, came in the summer of 1839, the same summer that they were building the first dam down at Baraboo, and he came up the Baraboo River to just the very southeast corner of what would now be the town of Excelsior, and settled there. And we know where this is because one of the historians said that this was near the Ho-Chunk village that Chief Dandy had, and it was in the southeast corner of the town of Excelsior, and this was written in 1873. It was said to be where Edward K. Hill now resides. Well, fortunately, we have an 1872 map of the town of Excelsior, that southeast corner, and here's E.K. Hill's farm right here. So I'll show you the current view in a minute, but suffice it to say this is Highway 136 today. This is Mirror Lake Road, and this is the road south to North Freedom. So that's where the first settler in these parts settled in 1839. His name was Joseph Finley. And again, would have been this farm right here where the solar panels are today. So when you're driving down 136, think about Mr. Finley right there. I really didn't realize that the river came this close to 136 until today when I was looking at this, or last night when I was looking at this aerial view. So now, Finley is also recorded in the 1918 Sauk County history as being part of the first duel, maybe the only duel in Sauk County history. And I'd like to read that account. Now, a man named Don Carlos Berry was one of the justices of the peace at Baraboo. He was the first one in the valley and claimed that the first lawsuit in the Baraboo precinct was brought before him. At one of the meetings of the Old Settlers Association, Mr. Canfield tells how he settled it. "We hope that it will not offend our neighbor, Archibald Barker," Canfield said, "to repeat the story of the first lawsuit and duel fought in the Baraboo precinct as related by D.C. Barry. Barry says that Captain Finley and Archibald Barker were continually having trouble, which culminated in a lawsuit before him. After hearing their jangling until he got tired of it, he proposed, as the captain was a Southern man, that he and Barker fight it out and not bother him. That he had a couple of pistols recently made out of a gun barrel by Hosey King that would make good dueling pistols. The captain said that he was agreed. Barry gave Barker a knowing wink, and he consented, except he would not take one of those long pistols. He wanted his old shotgun. The captain's back was up high, so that he consented to that, provided the distance should not be too long. It was arranged that they place their backs together and march to certain stakes set up for the purpose. Then, at the given word, wheel and fire. It was understood by the seconds, Levi Moore and D.C. Barry, that the weapons should be loaded with powder only. As agreed, they marched to the stakes, and as the word wheel and fire, Barker quickly wheeled and hallooed out, "You're a dead man," and blazed away with both barrels of his old shotgun. Captain Finley never even raised his pistol, but exclaimed, "Oh, aye," and for a moment thought he was hit. In a little while he saw the joke, and the matter was all settled satisfactorily over a bottle of whiskey. Thus ended one of the first lawsuits, if not the first, in the Baraboo precinct. So a little bit about Captain Finley. A little bit more about him is he didn't stay here terribly long. He sold out and went into logging and the lumber business up on the Lemonweir River, up in Juneau County, I believe. And apparently had a series of financial misfortunes up there, ultimately lost a leg and ended up in the poorhouse in Clark County. So our poor first settler here in the town of Excelsior. Now the first family, which was close on the heels of Captain Finley, was the family of James Christie, who was a Scotchman. He settled in March of 1840. The Ho-Chunk had been rounded up earlier that year, and Christie moved into the abandoned Ho-Chunk village of Chief Dandy, where 2 lodges and 2 lodges only were still standing. So Finley was right up about here, and he said it was near the Ho-Chunk village of Chief Dandy. So one of these 2 fields could have been the old Ho-Chunk Indian cornfields. And as the story said, there was 2 lodges left, so Christie used one of those for his house and the other one for a stable until they could build something more conventional to them. Eventually the Christie house was visited by many people. They were very amiable, but they didn't stay long either. They were moved to Newport, the settlement up on the Wisconsin River, in 1852. And then Canfield tantalizingly and tells us he was murdered and his body cast into a pond near Kilbourne City. That's it. So he doesn't tell us anymore. All right, so again, this is where Finley was and the E.K. Hill farmstead. The Christie place was labeled as the old Behringer place, so it could have been over here. However, there was also William Christie, who I think was a descendant over on this side. So somewhere in this area was the Ho-Chunk village of Chief Dandy, where the Christies moved in. Now it was several more years before, this was about 1840 when Finley and Christie were here. It was several more years before people really got into settling more of this area, especially southern Excelsior Township. It was even the late 1840s before Babs and D.C. Reed got up to what would become Reedsburg. So it took a while for settlement to catch on. So again, back to the, this is the official plat map for the town, what became the town of Excelsior. They weren't named by the federal government, they were just numbers. And again, this is what people were looking at in the land office in Mineral Point. And we'll start talking now about Stephen von Rensselaer Abelman, who chose this spot on the map to claim his own. So there's the man, Stephen von Rensselaer Abelman, was born December 25th, 1809, so Christmas Day, Guess what? In the town of Bethlehem, in Albany County, New York. How do you like that? So he was a Christmas gift to his parents. He was number 11 of 12 children born to Christian and Regina Abelman. So his mother was nursing or pregnant for 25 years of her life. Now, fortunately, we have a paint. Whoops! This is where Bethlehem Township is in Albany County, and where Albany County is in New York. The Hudson River comes up here, and the city of Albany is up here at the top, and that would be where Colonel Abelman would spend a lot of his early life. Fortunately, descendants of the family gifted the Sauk County Historical Society with several paintings, probably at least 70 years ago. This is Colonel Abelman's father, Christian Abelman. And if the story is all true, he was born in 1761 in Prussia. He was 16 or 17 years old. He was going to parochial school and was told not to stray too far near the port, which of course he did. He was kidnapped by or enticed onto a ship along with some other boys, where he was then basically kidnapped and conscripted into the Prussian or the Hessian Guard. And that was the Duke of Hesse who promised all these troops to come over here and fight for the American Revolution. So his father, Christian Abelman, was sent over here to fight along with the British during the American Revolution, if everything is true. He went to Canada on that ship in 1778, and then came down into New York with the Hessian Army. Probably wasn't dressed this well. I'm sure these were officers. Fortunately for him, he was sick, got sick, was captured, and was held at Fort Ticonderoga for a lot of the war until it ended. After it ended, he said he didn't want to he didn't want to go back because he'd probably already broken his mother's heart. And so he stayed here in the United States and eventually married Regina Canier, who was born in New York, but just a few months after her parents had landed from Bordeaux, France. Now, when Abelman was about 11 years old, his parents moved to Albany, and he was enrolled in school there. And when he was about 16, he enlisted as a drummer in the National Guard. After 7 years, he was elected as captain, and later in 1838, he was commissioned a colonel, and that's where he got the moniker Colonel Abelman. So he was colonel of the 240th Regiment of the New York State Militia. I don't think he fought a day in his life, but he was the colonel. By that time, 1838, both of his parents had died. His dad died in 1837 in Albany, and his mother previous to that in 1831. When he was just 22 years old. The colonel had also married by 1838, and he had 2 children by that time as well. He had married Elizabeth Bolt Jarvis in May of 1831, and they had 2 children together. Stephen Decatur Abelman was born in 1832, and Laura Elizabeth Abelman, born in 1836. Another tantalizing tidbit, Stephen Decatur Abelman, we're told, drowned in the Bay of San Francisco in March of 1853. And we have yet to find out why, who, how, what, where, and why. March of 1853, you're not swimming in the Bay of San Francisco. Why they were out, who was out there, we don't know, but we'll see if we can work on that. Laura Elizabeth Abelman did survive, and we'll talk about her later. She married Edwin Watson here in Sauk County in 1855. Now their mother, which we don't have a picture of, Elizabeth Bolt Jarvis Abelman, was described as a terrible sufferer for many years from rheumatism. For 12 years or more, she was totally unable to move except one little finger a trifle. She bore her affliction with heroic fortitude and was devotedly attended to with the most loving care by both husband and daughter until death ended her suffering. She must have been suffering by the time she came to Wisconsin. I imagine it was somewhat progressive. I'm sure he didn't drag her out here if she could only move a finger, but I'm sure she was suffering by the time she moved here, and she died here in Rock Springs or Abelman in 1860. The colonel was described as a man of Herculean build, weighing 312 to 325 pounds. No spindle-legged furniture for him in a Chippendale drawing room. Total wreck would have followed any attempt of his to be seated. During the administration of Franklin Pierce, President, Colonel Abelman was appointed United States Marshal for Wisconsin. And when in Washington to receive his appointment, he was introduced to President Pierce, who after surveying him for a moment said, "Well, Colonel, you are Abelman by name, a nobleman by nature. Altogether you are a colossal man. Let us shake." So with that, he became a U.S. Marshal. In Albany, Abelman was a carpenter and contractor. He had been apprenticed as that as a young man, and he's accredited with building some rather large buildings there. But he got the bug to move west, and in 1845 he came to Milwaukee, which looked fairly similar to this. This is a few years later. And he set up one of the first planing mills in the city of Milwaukee, and also made doors and window sashes. This was probably still a little too crowded for his notions, so in 1848 he made his first visit up here to Sauk County, probably heard about it from a friend, and eventually he got out here to the site and laid claim to the property where Narrows Creek meets the Baraboo River. He also saw the railroad potential, so again he got up this far on the Baraboo River and thought this would be a great spot for settlement. A little bit closer there. And he also saw the potential eventually for a railroad. If a railroad got into the Baraboo Valley, the only way it was going to get out was through the Upper Narrows Gorge. So he was right about that, although it took a while. Now the family moved to Baraboo in 1850 for a few years while they were getting things set up out here. Colonel Abelman is credited with building the Methodist Church. Possibly just the back half, the front half and the tower were added later in the 1860s, but this back half was built in 1853 and the colonel is credited with that. We also know that he supplied the plans for Sauk County's first real jail. We had a sham log jail before this. He made plans, won a competition actually in 1851, designing a 6-sided stone jail, 24 feet on each side. Of course, the octagon house and hexagon buildings were all the rage in the mid-1800s, so he designed a 6-sided jail for Sauk County. It wasn't built or finished until 1857, but it was his design, and it sat where the Baraboo Post Office sits today. One other building that we believe he built, according to one account, is the House of 7 Gables for banker Terrell Thomas in Baraboo. This was built in 1860. Now back here in Rock Springs, this is not it, but the closest thing we could find. The colonel first constructed a log cabin on the east side of the Baraboo River, and once that was done, he began hauling lumber from Baraboo for a real house. The cabin was big enough, probably a little bit bigger than this, for his family and 6 carpenters that were working on the frame house. Later, the log house that he had built became the first school here in Abelman. Fortunately, we have a picture of Colonel Abelman's house, amazingly. The Abelman House was built on the east side of the river. It was described by Eva Alexander in 1924. That house was not in the center of the village, but the only one on the east side of the river until you came to the house of Major Williams, the first farmhouse to the east. The Abelman House was really a farmhouse also and had a very large barn and barnyard and garden. Everyone who came to the colonel's was made to feel the human kindness which filled their hearts and overflowed toward all their guests, who were many, so many that Edward Gilmore, the colonel's stepson, once suggested that they had better hang out a sign and call it the Hotel de Marianne, Marianne being the name of his second wife. 1919, she also wrote, every summer vacation, Colonel Abelman's house, and indeed the whole of Abelman, was overrun and overflowed by Mrs. Abelman's flock of nephews and nieces, who always came then and stayed until school called them unwillingly home. Now, one thing we know he had inside was a Washington stove, actually a cast iron statue that had sat on top of his stove. This was made in New York and brought out here to the frontier. This was just a big statue of George Washington that sat on top of his stove, got heated up and helped radiate heat. And this was given to the Sauk County Historical Society many, many years ago after it sat outside at the Cliff House at Devil's Lake as a statue for many years. So that's available to see at the Sauk County Historical Museum. Now, about 1853, Abelman laid out the village right here at the confluence of Narrows Creek and the Baraboo River, and he named it Excelsior. Named it after the state motto for New York, which of course is where he was from, and that was the original name of the settlement here. Now, his first wife, Elizabeth Jarvis, who was so stricken with rheumatism, died here in May of 1860. And 5 years later, he married Mary Ann Watson Wise Gilmore, who was a widow, possibly married at least 2 times before that. She was 16 years younger than he, and making her only 10 years older than the colonel's daughter, Laura. The interesting part is she was also, get this, the sister of the colonel's son-in-law. So his daughter, Laura, married Ed Watson, whose sister married the colonel. It was the second wife of the colonel. So his son-in-law was also his brother-in-law. Very interesting.
But nothing illegal.
Nothing illegal, no. That's the way it was. In 1857, the colonel started a sawmill here on the creek, and this was north of Main Street, behind the coach house in that area. And that was eventually enlarged and also a grist mill added. So the colonel's house was somewhere in this stretch. Wait, where's the river? Somewhere in this stretch here between the tracks and the river. And on this was just a big open field, and the mill was somewhere over in this area, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Something that intervened to hamper enthusiasm, construction, and materials was the Civil War. Sauk County sent 646 men to serve in the Civil War. 285 of them died in battle, or more likely from injuries and disease. The town of Excelsior did its part, meeting all draft quotas that were enacted, and had a lot of men in Company F of the 23rd Regiment, which fought at Vicksburg and the Red River Campaign, amongst other places. And actually, Julius Hubbard from the town of Excelsior served in Company D of the 4th Infantry and was the first soldier from Sauk County to die in service. Now, during the Civil War and definitely afterwards, the hops boom hit Sauk County. The eastern crop was being decimated by the hops louse, and people realized in the 1860s that hops grew really, really well here in Sauk County. And by 1867, Sauk County was the leader of hops production in the entire country. Prices had gone from 5 to 10 cents a pound to 55 to 70 cents per pound. And in 1867 alone, 2 million pounds were harvested in Sauk County. I think that was 20% of the entire nation's crop. And that was obviously then well over $1 million in 1867 currency floating around Sauk County. So that had the Civil War had a dampening effect on improvements, but the hops boom certainly helped things out. I don't think too many, the hops areas that were real heavy were in Reedsburg, the town of Reedsburg, town of Winfield, some in Baraboo. This is actually the Potter hops field southeast of Baraboo, and Baraboo's in the background there. But it's a labor-intensive crop growing up on poles, which had to be taken down then, and a lot of women and boys and girls picked hops when it was in season. So that money eventually did help the county and settlements like Abelman. Shortly after the hops boom, 1868, Colonel Abelman built the Charter House, which was a hotel here in the settlement. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of it. This is obviously an advertisement for it from 1874. But then I'll show some other pictures of some standard taverns and hotels from the area. It would have sat directly opposite the Colonel's house, right on the corner where the gas station is today. And we'll read a little bit of Mrs. Alexander's description of it. She called it a great parallelogram of a house standing broadside to the wide open space between it and Narrows Creek, with no houses between except the mill on the creek and Mr. Stein's dwelling house and store, which somebody else describes as being exactly where the bank building is today. At this time, all the vast open space between the Charter House and the creek, the river and the rise of land to the west where the road from the bridge over the river climbed the hill and went past the little log schoolhouse and the few small houses clustered there, out into the country beyond, was included in the great mill yard, which was a very busy place some days, crowded with the many teams and men loading and unloading at the mill and going here and there wherever their business called them. The Charter House was about 2.5 stories high, facing this mill yard and extending back quite a distance. The road crossing the eastern side of the mill yard and toward the south on the west bank of the Baraboo River to the barns and outbuildings back of it. The front entrance was somewhat to the east of the center of the front and had a platform and steps extending from the door to the ground, furnishing seating capacity for loafers, youngsters, and others. So probably something like this. It had either a covered porch or a deck and steps extending across the front of the building. The front door opened into a wide hall extending straight through for a large dining room in the rear, the kitchens being back of that. On the west side of this central hall, the stairs ascended to the upper stories, and a door opened into the 3 or 4 large rooms occupied by the family, keeping the hotel, and one of these was used as a parlor for guests of the house. Across the wide hall in the northeast corner of the building was the office, and I believe between these and the dining room was a small room used for whatever purpose desired. Now, they called it the Charter House because the charter for the Baraboo Airline Railroad was apparently signed at the hotel. It probably was called, obviously, something that a few years before they signed that deed in 1870, but it became the Charter House to note its significance in signing the agreement that got a Baraboo Railroad Corporation together that was quickly purchased by the Chicago and Northwestern and brought the railroad through the Baraboo Valley, and we'll talk about that in a second. The hotel was run by the Colonel's daughter, Laura, and his son-in-law / brother-in-law, Ed Watson. They were described as being too hospitable to get rich very fast. Laura decorated her rooms probably with her mother's furniture from out east. It was described as rich, dark, old-fashioned black haircloth, and she had several large oil paintings, family portraits, which looked to me, as I remember them, very well done. And those certainly are the portraits that we showed you earlier of Laura, Stephen, and Christian Abelman. At some point, Abelman was said to have lost the Charter House, and it was run by other people after that, although he seemed to have been, or Watson seemed to have been employed later, and it burned in the 1880s. Colonel Abelman actually died in the Charter House in that little room between the dining room and the office that was used for whatever purpose desired. Before he died, however, he was very instrumental in getting the Baraboo, the railroad through the Baraboo Valley. Many attempts had been made since settlement in the 1840s to get a railroad through the Baraboo Valley, but the impediment of the Baraboo Bluffs was too much to overcome until the right time. In 1869, the Colonel wrote and published several articles in the Baraboo papers over the signature of locomotive, urging the people of the Baraboo Valley to organize for railroad purposes, and he laid down a plan of operation. The force with which these letters were written caused an organization to be made, which was entitled the Baraboo Airline Railroad Corporate Company. The colonel was chosen president of the company. The commencement of the work, and then the sale to the Chicago Northwestern Railroad Company and the construction of the line through the county within 1 year's time, was viewed with inexpressible satisfaction by the colonel. The Chicago and Northwestern Railroad Company, out of esteem for him, named the station at the village, then known as Excelsior, Abelman. The post office and village have since received the same name. And this is the 1872 map showing the line, the Chicago Northwestern line, through the Narrows and the depot near his house and Abelman. Now there's a lot of, the name, as we all know, goes back and forth, and we'll see that I think the next map maybe has, well, we'll get there in a second, but this is not here, but typical railroad construction. And as the railroad was built, shanties would be built along, you know, the route a certain distance ahead for the workmen, and that was done here in Rock Springs as well. And eventually a train similar to this entered Rock Springs in late 1871. And of course, the gap in the rocks was the place to get her through in a very photographed and photogenic spot. Here's the 1877 map of the town of Excelsior and elsewhere, and here we can see it's Abelman Station and the Rock Springs Post Office. So depending on who was making maps and writing histories and stuff, and I think when it was called Abelmans at certain points, that referred to either Abelman's Mills before the railroad came through, or Abelman's Station, here Abelman Station. But again, just depends on who's writing the document or creating the map. You can also see that Reedsburg had an H on the end, and that's the official name for Reedsburg until they got rid of the H because it looked too German. Now a little word about the bridges. Of course, Rock Springs has more than a few due to its locality. This is the bridge over Narrows Creek at one point, and that was later replaced with a covered bridge. There was at least 3, if not 4, covered bridges in the vicinity at one time. One over Main Street at the Baraboo River, one north of town where the last point of crossing of the Baraboo River is, one west of town, and I think one over Narrows Creek as well. There might have been 2 north of town, so there could have been 5 altogether. It's a little hard to tell. Three of these, at least, were built by Jerry Dodd, who was a Baraboo carpenter, who built, all told, 7 covered bridges in Sauk County in the 1870s. He got quite good at it. And if you know the bridge down in Cedarburg, the last covered bridge in situ in Wisconsin, I believe that was also built by Jerry Dodd. The sign there said it was built of Baraboo pine, and it's exactly the same construction detailed in the Baraboo papers for the bridges we had around here, and that was large 3x10 planks made into a crisscross fashion, which made a sort of tube. And these, it's probably propped up now because it's being taken down, and down here as well. But these were completely clear span bridges when they were built. Not sure when or how they did it, but they could span up to 166 feet with one of these covered bridges.
Lattice truss.
What's that?
Lattice truss.
Yeah, lattice truss, yep. Mm-hmm. Here's a picture of the one north of town. I think this is the last crossing of the Baraboo River. Of course, the quarry in the background. A little better picture of that here. And at one time the road crossed the river again back here, so I'm not sure if that had a covered bridge as well. Here you can see by 1896, this line through the Baraboo Valley from Madison up to Winona was so popular that they double-tracked the line in 1896, which again wasn't as much work as the first time, but was still a monumental effort to get a second track put through the valley. So back to Colonel Abelman and a little story about one of those bridges that, again, we're thankful to Eva Alexander for recording. She said, among the animals belonging to the mill and its owners and running at large wherever they willed was a savage old hog, a good deal. I should judge, like the Razorbacks of the South, this hog had a habit of going for anybody when it chose and chasing them off the premises. There used to be a story which was told to me by someone up there that this hog went after Colonel Abelman once and chased him into the old covered bridge, where he had to climb up on the inside and yell for someone to come out and drive it off. When you think that Colonel Abelman was very tall and broad-shouldered and weighed at least 312 pounds, you will realize the state that the chase was something to see. We'll get into the quarries the next time, but of course the quarry was a big deal here in Rock Springs and still is. Of course the railroad going right next to it was a big help, and of course there's more to cover. And of course eventually a nice little hamlet developed with more than one department store and general store and saloons and taverns and churches and things like that. But we'll get into that next time. The street looks wider there than it does today, I think. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for coming, and we will see you later.